The courier cleared 3 security checkpoints without triggering a single alert. That was how Xiang Quan knew the attack had already succeeded. The envelope arrived at 6 a.m., cream stock, Zurich postmark. He read it at his desk in the gray Seoul morning, his coffee untouched, the mansion still quiet around him. 41 pages. International Maritime Jurisdiction, the Morgan O Commercial Inheritance Structure, a formal application for custodial oversight review of the O-Siang twin heirs, filed through a neutral arbitration body registered in Geneva. Filed 6 weeks ago, while he was still dismantling the elders. A preliminary review could be scheduled within 30 days. While he was watching the perimeter, someone had already entered the house. At the bottom of the final page, a contact signature. Seo Jin-ho. No title, no syndicate affiliation listed, just a name and a Geneva phone number, and beneath it a single handwritten line in clean, unhurried script. I have no interest in your throne, only in the future of your sons. I think, if you're honest with yourself, you'll find our goals are identical. Xiang Quan set the document down and looked at the baby monitor on the corner of his desk. The twins were still sleeping. The purge removed the wolves inside the house. It didn't account for the lawyer waiting politely at the gate. Seo Jin-ho doesn't want Xiang Quan dead. He wants him irrelevant. And in a world governed by international arbitration and inheritance law, a man who built his empire on controlled silence has no weapons. For the first time, the most dangerous thing Xiang Quan can do is speak. The question is whether he knows how, and whether he can do it before Jin-ho turns his sons into a legal instrument neither parent can hold. Brielle read the filing in 40 minutes. Xiang Quan knew this because he had given it to her without being asked, sliding it across the study desk with the same wordless efficiency he used for shipping manifests and shell company structures. And she had taken it with the same focused quiet she brought to everything he handed her now. She set it down. She looked at the wall for a moment in the way she looked at things that required internal recalibration rather than immediate response. Then she turned to him. He's not wrong about the legal structure, she said. The dual heritage registration was my father's doing. I inherited the vulnerability with the assets. Can it be unwound? Not faster than he can file. She paused. He's been building this for months, Xiang Quan. He's not reacting to the purge. He planned around it. She looked at him steadily. He held his gaze a second longer than necessary. He did not look away, but he did not answer. The room held that implication without either of them touching it. Outside, one of the twins had awakened, a soft, searching sound from the monitor on the shelf, resolving itself quickly back into silence. There's only one answer to a legitimacy hearing. You know what it is. He did. That was precisely the problem. He read it twice before he called anyone. That was unusual. Sung Quan was not a man who needed to read things twice. By the time Brielle arrived at the study door, still in the early quiet of the morning, one twin on her hip, her hair loose, the filing was spread across the desk in 3 organized sections, and his coffee was cold. She looked at the pages, then at him, and handed the baby to the nurse who had followed her down the hall without being asked. She sat across from him and read. He watched her face the way he watched everything now, with the attention of a man who had stopped pretending he wasn't watching. Jin-ho filed this 6 weeks ago, she said without looking up, while the restructure was still active. Which means he had the timeline. She turned a page. He knew what you were dismantling and when. He built around it. She set the page down and looked at him directly. That's not intelligence gathering. That's placement. Sung Quan said nothing. She had arrived at the same conclusion he had, faster and without the 2 readings it had cost him. The audit began that afternoon. Quiet, surgical, run through a single trusted director whose loyalty predated the syndicate by a decade. Sung Kwan gave him 4 names, the 4 newest board appointments, the ones confirmed during the restructure's final week, and asked for financial histories going back 7 years. No explanation. The director didn't ask for one. Brielle spent the afternoon with the files. She made notes in her own shorthand in the margins, the same way she had been doing since the early days of the East Wing study sessions, and by evening she had mapped the legal architecture of Jin-ho's case with the clean, unsentimental precision of someone who had grown up watching her father run a shipping empire and had absorbed more than anyone had intended. She found him in the corridor outside the nursery at 9 o'clock. "The dual heritage registration is the anchor of his whole case," she said. "If he can establish that the twins have a legitimate claim to the Morgan commercial network independent of the syndicate, the arbitration body has grounds to argue they need neutral oversight. He doesn't need to prove you're unfit, he just needs to prove you're insufficient. And the Morgan registration can't be restructured in time. Not legally." She paused. "Not without triggering a separate filing that would look like obstruction." The corridor was quiet around them. From inside the nursery, the soft rhythm of the sound machine moved steadily through the door. His phone lit up on the table beside him, his legal contact in Geneva. He read the message once, set the phone face down, and was still for a moment in a way that Brielle had learned to read accurately. "Second notice," she said, not a question. "Preliminary hearing, 8 weeks." She absorbed it without visible alarm. That was its own kind of steadiness. 8 weeks wasn't enough to dismantle him. It was barely enough to see him clearly. "Then we start tomorrow," she said. He looked at her. She was already turning back toward the nursery to check on the twins, unhurried, as if the ground shifting beneath them was simply something to be accounted for and moved through. He watched her go. The clock on the wall read 9:14 p.m. 8 weeks. The message arrived on a Tuesday, routed through a channel that had no connection to the syndicate's infrastructure. Brielle had built it herself 18 months ago, through a series of commercial encryption layers she had never explained to anyone. It was the same channel she had used to hire her first security contact before the twins were born. She read it twice. Then she set her phone face down on the nursery changing table and finished what she was doing, because one of the twins needed her, and so Jin-ho could wait. His message was 4 sentences. No preamble, no legal language, no pressure. He introduced himself by name, acknowledged that she already knew who he was, said he would find a conversation useful if she was willing, and closed with a time and a location: a public tea room in Jongno, the kind of place with good sightlines and no syndicate adjacency. He had signed it with his given name only, not his title, not his affiliation. The courtesy was deliberate. She understood that. It was also, underneath the deliberateness, completely genuine, which was the more unsettling part. She found Sung Kwan in the East Wing study after the twins were down. He was at the desk, working through the audit results, 3 separate documents open in front of him. He looked up when she entered. She told him plainly, the channel, the message, the 4 sentences, the tea room in Jongno. She didn't editorialize. She gave him the facts in the order they had arrived, and then she waited. He was still for a moment. Not the stillness she knew, not the controlled architectural quiet he used in boardrooms and corridors, and every room where someone needed to understand who held the most authority. This was different. This was the stillness of a man who had just registered something he hadn't prepared for, and the preparation gap was visible, briefly, in the set of his jaw and the way his eyes moved to the middle distance rather than directly at her. It lasted 3 seconds, then it was gone. "He used your channel," Sung Kwan said. "Yes. Not a syndicate intercept, not a third-party breach." He looked at her now evenly. "He built access to something you constructed independently. Which means he's been watching me longer than the purge," she said, "possibly longer than the restructure." The implications settled between them without either of them naming it fully. Jin-ho hadn't reacted to Sung Kwan. He had studied Brielle. He had been tracking her, her infrastructure, her contacts, her independent architecture, as a separate subject of study. He understood her value before Sung Kwan had acknowledged it publicly. Sung Kwan set his pen down with a precision that was doing a great deal of work. "You're going to tell me you want to take the meeting," he said. "I'm going to tell you I think I should." She held his gaze. "Those are different things." The silence that followed was the kind that required both of them to stay in it honestly. "I know," he said finally. It was the closest he had come in two parts of this story to admitting that her judgment exceeded his in any territory. Neither of them remarked on it, but it stayed in the room long after the conversation moved on. He didn't say don't go. He said it was tactically unsound, that meeting Jinho without a strategic framework in place was premature, that the tea room's sightlines were adequate but not optimal. He said these things to the middle distance while Brielle put on her coat, and when she picked up her bag, he finally looked at her directly and said nothing at all. That was his consent. She recognized it by now. The tea room was quiet for a Wednesday afternoon. Jinho was already seated when she arrived, a deliberate choice, she noted, giving her the positional advantage of the entrance. He stood when she approached, which was either genuine courtesy or a very good performance of it, and she decided within the first 30 seconds that the answer was both. He was younger than she'd expected, composed in the way of someone who had never needed to perform composure because it had simply always been his natural register. He poured tea without asking if she wanted it. "I appreciate you coming," he said. "I came for information, not goodwill." He smiled slightly. "I know. That's why I think this will be a productive conversation." He was, as she had anticipated, entirely reasonable. He outlined his legal position without embellishment, acknowledged its pressure points without being asked, and explained his interest in the twins with the calm conviction of a man who had genuinely persuaded himself that his motives were clean. He wasn't lying. He believed the oversight structure was necessary. He believed Sung Kwan's documented instability was a risk. He believed he was the responsible option. She listened without interruption. She asked 3 questions, each one landing in a gap he hadn't fully closed. He answered all 3, and his answers told her more than he intended. When the tea was finished, he slid a plain envelope across the table. No ceremony, no explanation attached. "I thought you should have this before the hearing," he said, "not as leverage, as context." She opened it after she left the tea room, standing on the pavement in the gray afternoon with her security contact a careful distance behind her. The photograph was old, printed, not digital, which meant it had come from a physical archive rather than a surveillance file. Sung Kwan at 19, sharp-jawed and unformed in the way of young men who hadn't yet settled into themselves. Standing at what was clearly an initiation, the framing, the room, the posture of the men around him told her that without requiring explanation. Beside him, close enough to suggest significance, a figure whose face had been cleanly redacted. Not obscured, not blurred, redacted. Deliberately, carefully, by someone who wanted the presence acknowledged without the identity revealed. She stood with the photograph for a long moment. The city moved around her, indifferent. Jinho's file on Sung Kwan didn't begin with the purge. It didn't begin with the elders. It began here, at 19, in a room with a man whose face someone decided she wasn't ready to see yet. She put the photograph back in the envelope and called her car. The security check was routine. Sung Kwan ran them himself twice a week now, a habit that had started as protocol and had quietly become something else without his having formally acknowledged the change. The nursery, the corridor, the window seals, the monitor connections. 4 minutes, usually, efficient and impersonal. He was checking the secondary camera mount above the crib when the smaller twin woke. Not with crying, just with the sudden, complete alertness that infants produce without warning, eyes open and tracking, the small face arranged in an expression of serious inquiry. He looked at Sung Kwan with the unfocused but genuine attention of someone who had not yet learned to be selective about who deserved it. Sung Kwan went still. The baby's hand moved, the unhurried, exploratory movement of a 4-month-old discovering the radius of his own reach, and found Sungkwan's finger where it rested on the crib rail. The grip was reflexive, probably, physiological. Sungkwan understood this. He didn't move anyway. He stayed like that for longer than the check required. The camera mount remained uninspected. The corridor outside was quiet. He was aware of Brielle in the doorway before she spoke. Her presence had a particular quality of stillness that he had become, without intending to, attuned to. "What are you going to call him?" The question was quiet, no pressure in it. She had been watching long enough to ask it without it being intrusive, which meant she had been watching long enough to know something had happened in the room that warranted the question. He looked at the baby. The grip on his finger had not loosened. "Junho," he said. It came out the way things come out when the decision was made somewhere below the level of deliberation. His father's name. He had not planned to say it. He had not planned to say anything. Brielle made no sound behind him. He didn't look at her. He stayed one moment longer, then carefully, without disturbing the sleep the baby was already drifting back into, he freed his hand and left the room. She didn't follow. He was grateful for that. He found her later in the study, near 11, when the house was fully quiet. She was at the desk with the photograph from Junho's envelope, which she had shown him 2 days ago and which neither of them had fully finished discussing. She looked up when he entered. He was about to speak about the photograph when she said, evenly and without particular emphasis, "I heard you in the hallway, the night of the fever. You stood outside the nursery door for several minutes." The room held the statement without moving. He looked at her for a long moment. Her expression was open in the careful way of someone who has decided to put something down and is waiting to see what happens when they do. He said nothing. He left the room. He did not go to bed. He sat in the dark of the east corridor for a long time with his back against the wall outside the nursery door, in almost exactly the same position he had occupied 4 months ago, listening to 2 children breathe on the other side of the wood, and for the first time in a very long while, he had no protocol for this. The director's name was Lim Chae-won, 38, third-tier board appointment, confirmed during the restructure's final week. His financial history had taken 4 days to unravel, not because it was well hidden, but because Junho had been patient enough to layer it across 7 years of entirely legitimate transactions, with a single irregular thread running underneath, visible only if you knew exactly where to look. Sungkwan had known exactly where to look. The meeting was held in the East Conference Room with 2 of Sungkwan's senior security and no legal counsel present, which communicated everything about the nature of the proceedings before a word was spoken. Brielle was at the far end of the room, not summoned, not excluded. She had simply been there when it began, and Sungkwan had not asked her to leave. She watched him work. It was the first time since the hospital that she had seen him fully inhabit the version of himself that the syndicate had been built around. Not the man who stood outside nursery doors, not the man who had said his father's name over a crib without meaning to. This was the original architecture, economical, precise, completely without temperature. He asked questions that were not really questions. He waited with the patience of someone who understood that silence was a more effective instrument than pressure. Lim Chae-won lasted 11 minutes before the shape of his own answers collapsed around him. Brielle watched and understood something she filed carefully away. The cold hadn't been replaced. It had simply learned to share the space with everything that had grown alongside it. Both things were true simultaneously. Both things were real. She wasn't sure yet whether that made him more legible or less. Lim was being escorted out when he stopped at the door. A last calculation, visible in the way his posture shifted. The decision of a man choosing what to spend his remaining leverage on. "The fitness clause," he said, without turning fully around. Junho filed a secondary component 3 weeks ago. Psychological fitness. If he can establish a pattern of irrational decision-making in your public handling of the family, the rejection, the reversal, the escalation, the arbitration body can accelerate the custody review without waiting for the full hearing. Sung Kwan said nothing. He's been documenting since the hospital, Lim continued. The discharge papers, the secondary estate order, all of it. Every public inconsistency between what you said then and what you've done since. He paused. The rejection itself is the centerpiece. He has the discharge papers, the security logs, the staff records. In a fitness framework, what happened that day reads as a man who couldn't be trusted with his own judgment. He left. The door closed. The room was very still. Brielle looked at Sung Kwan across the length of the conference table. He was standing with both hands flat on the surface, his eyes on the middle distance, and the stillness around him was the kind that precedes a recalibration rather than a response. The hospital, the discharge papers, liabilities, his own words filed in Geneva, waiting to be read aloud by strangers who would only know him as he had been that morning. She didn't say anything, neither did he. But they both understood that the hearing was no longer about legal architecture. It was about the distance between who he had been and who he was now, and whether he could prove, in public, on record, that the distance was real. The household went quiet around 10. The twins were down, the security rotation had turned over, and the East Wing settled into the particular stillness that Brielle had come to recognize as the mansion's version of rest. Not peaceful, exactly, but suspended. She was at the study desk with Jinho's documents when Sung Kwan came in. He didn't sit immediately. He moved to the window the way he did when something required physical management before it could be spoken, stood there a moment, then took the chair across from her. He was quiet for long enough that she set her pen down. "Did you know," he said, and then stopped. Started again. "Before the hospital, did you know that I would do what I did?" It didn't arrive like a calculated question. It arrived like something he had composed carefully and then abandoned the composition of at the last moment, choosing the unfinished version because the finished one had too much architecture around it. Brielle looked at him. His eyes were on the desk between them, not on her, which was its own kind of exposure. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that the sound machine from the nursery down the hall became audible in the silence between them. Then she told him. 8 months into the pregnancy, she said, she had identified a security contact through a commercial channel with no syndicate adjacency. She had cultivated the relationship over 6 weeks, established an encrypted line, confirmed his competence through 2 test assignments she had constructed to appear routine. By the time she went into labor, she had a parallel infrastructure in place, small, targeted, entirely her own, that existed specifically for the scenario in which the syndicate's protection became the thing she needed protection from. She told him this without apology and without cruelty, plainly, the way she delivered most true things. Sung Kwan was very still. The silence that followed was the longest yet. Not hostile, not accusatory. It was the silence of 2 people sitting with the full, unmediated weight of what had existed between them before either of them had acknowledged it openly. The mutual calculation, the mutual contingency planning, the marriage that had been a contract and a question mark in equal measure from the beginning. He had prepared for her to need him. She had prepared for him to fail her. Both things had been true. Neither of them had said it until now. He looked at her finally. She looked back. Neither of them looked away. His phone moved on the desk beside him. A notification, then another, then the specific pattern of his Geneva legal contact's number. He picked it up, read it, set it down with a care that was doing considerable work. "Formal summons," he said. "Personal appearance. 3 weeks. They can't be refused?" No. She absorbed this. 3 weeks to prepare a man who had built an empire on silence to speak, truthfully, about his own family in front of an international arbitration body, on record, with Jinho's fitness clause waiting underneath every word like a current. "Then we start tomorrow," she said, for the second time, as if the ground shifting was simply something you named and moved through. He looked at her across the desk for a moment longer than necessary. Yes, he said, we do. The sessions happened in the East Wing study, late afternoon, when the twins slept and the house was quietest. No documents, no legal frameworks. Brielle had put Jinho's filing away on the first day and hadn't brought it back out. They don't need your argument, she told him. They have all the arguments. They need to see something the documents can't replicate. Sung Kwan sat across from her with the stillness of a man who had survived every difficult room he had ever entered by making himself unreadable. And she spent the first 2 sessions simply asking him to be readable, not performed, not constructed, just present. It was the hardest thing she had asked of him. She started with facts. When did you first understand the twins were real to you, not strategically, not as heirs, but as people? He was quiet for a long time before he answered. The answer, when it came, was not what she expected. Not the nursery, not the fever. Earlier, a routine security briefing in which the analyst had referred to them by number rather than position, and something in Sung Kwan had responded to that with a coldness directed outward rather than inward, and he had understood in that moment that the distinction mattered to him. He said this without looking at her. She wrote nothing down. She moved gradually toward the harder questions. Not the hospital, she left that until last, but the weeks between. The safe room protocol updated before the explosion, the audit begun within hours of the filing, the decisions that preceded any formal acknowledgement of what was driving them. You were protecting us, she said, before you would admit you were protecting us. He looked at the desk. Yes. Say that at the hearing, exactly that. It sounds like weakness. It sounds like a man who changed. She held his gaze steadily. That's the only thing Jinho's case cannot accommodate. He built his fitness argument on a fixed point, the man at the hospital. If you can show the arbitration body a man in motion, his entire framework loses its anchor. By the 3rd session, something had shifted between them in the way of things that shift without announcement. He was answering faster. The careful architecture around his responses had developed gaps, not careless ones, but the kind that appear when someone has decided, incrementally, that the room is safe enough to lower the cost of honesty. She noticed. She didn't remark on it. She simply continued. The night before the hearing, her phone rang while she was in the nursery. Her Geneva contact. She listened for 40 seconds, said 3 words, and ended the call. She found Sung Kwan in the corridor. Someone tried to kill Jinho an hour ago, outside his hotel. He went still. My people? Weren't involved. He's already confirmed it. She watched him process this. Whoever it was wanted the hearing to collapse, not to stop Jinho's case, to keep the custody question permanently unresolved. The corridor was silent. Someone benefits from the ambiguity, Sung Kwan said slowly. Someone who was never an elder, someone the purge didn't reach. They looked at each other in the dim hallway, the sound machine a faint pulse behind the nursery door, and understood simultaneously that the hearing tomorrow was no longer the most dangerous thing on the horizon. It was the only thing standing between their children and a threat that hadn't yet shown its face. The arbitration chamber was smaller than she had expected. Neutral gray walls, a long panel table, 5 arbitrators arranged with the careful impartiality of people whose profession required them to have no visible reaction to anything. Jinho sat to the left with his legal counsel, composed and unhurried, a bruise at his temple the only evidence of the previous night. He had dressed well. He had come prepared. He looked like a man who had already accounted for every possible version of this morning. Brielle sat beside Seong Kwan at the respondents' table, not behind him, not positioned as support staff or observer, beside him, as the twins' mother and the other party to the marriage under review, which was her legal right and which she had exercised without discussion. She did not look at him when he began to speak. He had no notes, she had told him not to bring any, and he had understood why. Notes would look like preparation, and preparation would look like performance, and performance was exactly what Jinho's fitness framework was designed to absorb and redirect. The only thing it couldn't process was the unscripted truth of a man who had actually changed. He spoke for 11 minutes. He did not use legal language. He did not construct an argument. He described, with the economy of someone who had spent a lifetime saying less than he meant, what had happened between the hospital and now, not as a defense, but as a sequence of events that had their own internal logic if you understood what had driven them. He described the twins without sentiment, and with a specificity that was more affecting than sentiment would have been. He said Jinho's name. He said the girl's name, Seon, which Brielle had chosen, and which he had learned, quietly, without telling her he had learned it. She kept her eyes on the panel table in front of her. She was aware of him the way you are aware of something that requires steadiness from you in order to continue. The 5 arbitrators watched him with the attention of people who had expected a different kind of man. 2 of them made notes. One of them had stopped making notes entirely, which meant she was listening rather than cataloging. Jinho was very still. At the recess, he found Brielle in the corridor outside, apart from both legal teams. He came alone, without counsel, which told her the conversation was not for the record. "The attempt last night," he said quietly. "I know who ordered it." She waited. He gave her a name, Korean, 2 syllables, spoken with the careful neutrality of someone delivering something they understand to be significant. She didn't recognize it immediately. Then the context assembled itself. Not from the syndicate's recent history, not from the elder structure, but from something older. The photograph. 19-year-old Seongkwan at the initiation, the redacted face beside him. "He was never an elder," he said quietly. "He was there before the elders, before the current structure, before almost everything." He looked at her steadily. The purge didn't reach him because no one built the map far enough back to find him. The corridor hummed with the quiet industry of the building around them. "Why are you telling me?" she asked. "Because Seongkwan will handle this the way he handles everything, and this particular man cannot be handled that way." He held her gaze for a moment. "But you already know that." The name Jinho had given her led to a man named O.J. Sung, not a relative, the shared surname a coincidence Seongkwan received without expression when she told him, which told her it wasn't a coincidence at all, only something he had known and never surfaced. Jae-sung had been the architect of the syndicate's original structure, 2 decades before Seongkwan took it apart and rebuilt it in his own image. He had stepped back quietly when the new order consolidated. He had never been removed because he had never appeared to be a threat. He had been waiting for exactly the kind of fracture the hospital had created. They moved on him together, not because the situation required both of them, Seongkwan's operational capacity was sufficient, but because Brielle had the financial thread and Seongkwan had the access, and using both simultaneously closed the window before Jae-sung could identify which direction the pressure was coming from. She worked from the East Wing study, he worked from the field. They communicated in the terse, efficient shorthand of people who had learned each other's thinking well enough to compress it. It took 31 hours. Jae-sung was contained without violence, a deliberate choice that Seongkwan made and didn't explain, and that Brielle understood without requiring explanation. A man that old, embedded for 2 decades, was more valuable as leverage than as a lesson. The syndicate's new board received a briefing. The relevant documentation was secured. The threat was neutralized in the way that lasts. Jinho withdrew the custody filing 4 days after the hearing. His message to Brielle was 3 sentences, formal, final, and without self-pity. He had filed for resolution, he wrote, not for permanence. The question was resolved. He wished the children well, and he meant it, which was the thing about Jinho that had always been the most difficult to manage. The syndicate held. For now. Brielle found the stillness strange at first, not uncomfortable, but unfamiliar, the way a room feels after furniture has been removed. She moved through the mansion's routines with the twins, with the staff, with the steady infrastructure of a household that had survived 2 parts of a war and was now, tentatively, in something that resembled peace. She was in the nursery at 9 when Sung Kwan appeared in the doorway. Both twins were awake, the particular wide-eyed wakefulness of 4-month-olds encountering the ceiling as if it contained information. Junho had his fist against his mouth. The girl was making the focused, private sounds of someone conducting an internal investigation. Sung Kwan came to stand beside Brielle at the crib rail. He looked at the twins for a long time without speaking. She let the silence be what it was. Then, quietly, without ceremony, he said the girl's name, Siyeon. Brielle went still. He said it the way he had said Junho's name over the crib weeks ago, not offered, not performed, simply present, as if the name had always been there and he had simply, finally, decided to use it. She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her. She hadn't told him her name. He had learned it the way he had learned everything that mattered to him in the last several months, quietly, privately, without announcing the learning. He held his gaze and said nothing. He said nothing. The twins continued their private investigations of the ceiling between them. The silence was not the silence of 2 people waiting for something. It was the silence of 2 people who had arrived somewhere and were taking a moment to understand that they had. Whatever came next would be chosen, deliberately, with full knowledge of the cost, by 2 people who had already paid enough to know the price was real. He didn't move to leave. For the first time, neither did she. The 3rd player had been removed. The hearing was closed. The children had names. But in the 41 pages of Jinho's original filing, buried in an appendix that neither of them had reached until now, was a single reference, a financial trail linking the Morgan Shipping Alliance to an organization that predated both the syndicate and the Morgan name. One Brielle's father had once worked for, one that had been watching the twins since before they were born, not from a distance, but from inside the architecture of their lives. Sung Kwan read it at 2 a.m. with the baby monitor beside him, and for the first time in the story, he was the one who was afraid. When Brielle woke the next morning, he was already in the study, and he was not alone.